3 days ago, on 15th August 2020, India celebrated its 74th Independence Day. 15th August 1947 was also the day India was partitioned into two independent nations, India and Pakistan. But this story, this narrative of partition, which is one of the most, which one could say is one of the most violent events in world history, remained buried under the grand narrative of the grand jubilant narrative of independence. And in the race to move forward, because we have been involved in the task of nation building and moving on, we seem to have these stories seem to have been forgotten. They did figure in official histories of the nation, but the partition was represented in these official histories as an aberration. The violence of partition was represented as an aberration or a kind of necessary sacrifice for the formation of the nation. 30 years ago, feminist historians led by Urvashi Butalia and Ritu Menon broke the silence on the partition of India, in which almost 1 million people died. And I'm using Professor Ganesh Kudesia's figures. In his figures, almost 15 million people were displaced. And yet, very few people knew about these stories, except the survivors and their descendants. As a child, as a school girl growing up in Chennai, I was amazed that most of my classmates didn't know what partition was. And unlike me and my friends who only mingle with people who had a partition story. So we thought everyone knew the story, and yet there were parts of India, not just in the deep south, where very few people were aware of what happened because we were so busy celebrating this our independence. Now, over the last 30 years, partition scholars have been trying to unravel this event, which seems to be inexplicable. Reams of paper, and now um, many megabytes have been devoted to why it happened, how it happened, what was the reason for the violence that accompanied partition, why did India have to be partitioned at all, and yet we don't seem to have found the answers. They in the stories, the Pandora's box which Butalia and Menon open seem to have unleashed a kind of torrent of stories which seem to be unending. It seems like every story invokes the telling of other stories because it looks like all the stories have still not been told. And as uh, the last of the survivors, somebody has to mute their mic. Uh, with the anxiety of the dwindling generation of survivors, partition survivors is about to disappear, has almost started a race, what I call the partition industry. Everyone seems to be in a big hurry, a tearing hurry to record this, document these stories before they are lost forever. And some of these initiatives are digital. Gunita Bhalla started the 1947 partition archive. There are many others, India of the past, India memories of the past, and we ourselves have been trying to document these stories. So my question is, why aren't we joining the cheerleaders and trying to bask in the glory of what our nation has achieved? Why is it that we still hung up on partition? Even survivors say, come on, move on. Why are we talking about it? They moved ahead and moved on. So why are we still hung up? Why are we still trying to remember partition? That's That's one of the reasons why we thought of beginning the series, because it looks like that we're still living in the shadow of partition. Any incident of communal violence in India evokes, brings back horrifying memories of what happened in the run up to independence. More recently, the caravans of migrant workers making their way to the villages on foot again evoke those memories of migrants, people who were displaced during the partition of 1947, except that their cloth bundles were now displaced by rucksacks, backpacks. But everyone, the images evoke that memory. So, with that, we thought that it's high time that the new generation, our younger scholars in particular, come to know about what lessons can the survivors of partition offer us, what lessons can partition offer us. So with that objective in mind, we thought of beginning this series on partition of India, and we were overwhelmed by the response we received from scholars across the world, historians, political scientists, literary scholars, filmmakers, oral historians, everyone readily agreed to join us, and we'll be listening. So it looks like what we had planned was a 3 day webinar turned out to be a semester long series. So we're going to have a series of lectures every week, one lecture or more than two lectures a week, which and we try to cover every not only the partition in the west, which is the which is focuses on Punjab, but also Sindh, and then to the east we move on to partition of Bengal, we go on to northeast, and if possible we'll also try to cover Ladakh. We couldn't think of anyone better than Professor Ahmed to tell us, to kick off this series on partition. The reason being that Professor Ahmed is not only an eminent scholar, but he's one of the few scholars who has not talked only about, who's been collecting stories not only from India, but also from Pakistan and from other parts of the world. So I was so delighted because not only because I'm a great admirer of his work, but also I thought that this would take us beyond Punjab, Sindh, or Bengal, because we'll be able to talk about all paths, all borders, with Professor Ahmed guiding us. Uh, Partition scholars don't need an introduction to Professor Ahmed, but those of you who are not familiar with his work, I would take a few minutes to introduce him. Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed is a Swedish political scientist, and he's an author of Pakistani descent. He holds a PhD in political science from Stockholm University. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Stockholm University, but he's also held positions in LUMS, that's the Lahore Institute, University of Management Sciences, as well as the Government College, University Lahore. He was a senior fellow at Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. That's where I had the pleasure and honor of meeting him and learning about his work face to face. He's also involved, he's an honorary fellow at the South Asia Institute in the National Institute of University of Singapore, the South Asian Studies program. Uh, I don't want to cut into his time. So I would quickly talk about his books. There's a long list of books and articles. And before I met him, I had used many of his articles in my books. Uh, the book which is more relevant for today's talk is The Punjab Bloodied, Partition and Cleansed, unraveling the 1947 tragedy through secret British reports and first-person accounts. He was writing this book when we met, and since then, this was first published in 2011 by Rupa Publications and then by Oxford University Press in 2012. But after that, it's been translated into many languages, Punjabi, as well as Gurmukhi, Hindi, and I'm sure there are many more translations to come. Professor Ahmed also runs a weekly column on politics, uh, history, and also Lahore. He's also a historian of Lahore. And on Bollywood, which we'll probably talk about towards the end. So, without further ado, I would request Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed to begin his lecture. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes. Professor Anjali Roy, how can I thank you enough for inviting me to come and talk on this subject? It's very close to my heart. And this book that you mentioned on the partition of the Punjab took me 12 years to complete. I got a grant just for 3 years. So you can imagine the amount of devotion it received from me, and my very great delight, it's been very well received. At least I think you said nobody has been able to decipher or explain why partition. Well, I think in the Punjab book, I do. There is nobody who has on either side or in Great Britain gotten up and questioned the explanation I give, because I'm a political scientist and not simply a historian. So I brought in all those angles of what is ethnicity and ethnic cleansing and so on. So that book in itself is now very well received all over the world. And that's the reason we are such great friends. You know, all these years after Singapore, we have been in touch. And so let me address the theme given me. And it is the partition of India, Bengal, and Punjab, a case of conflicting nationalist visions. Yeah. To put it very plainly, India stood for a united India with an effective government, arguing that all Indians, irrespective of their religion, their ethnicity, their sect, their cult, their caste, were Indians. Anybody who was a bona fide product of India was an Indian. I would say that this tradition of territorial nationalism goes way back in history, but it is the French model associated with it. The French Revolution was based on territoriality, although they made the French language as the factor around which people were assimilated into the French nation. Now, the second main, these are ideal forms of Weber that I'm talking about, because there are variations of all these models, but there are two main models. The second is the Germanic model. The Germanic model assumes that people, by virtue of some particularity, like their, bloodline, their culture, their language, or religion, they stand out from the rest. Now, the Indian National Congress, I would argue, was standing up from the French model of nationalism, which I must also underline is the form of nationalism which prevailed in all colonial countries against a foreign occupying force. So this has been the mainstream type of nationalism with all its variations. When it comes to the All India Muslim League, it took a diametrically opposite position. It argued that India was not one nation of all Indians. It was composed of several nationalities, among which the Muslims and Hindus were the biggest Jinnah would call them nations. The Sikhs he would describe as sub-nations, and he had a very unclear idea about the Dravidian people of the south and the Dalits also. I mean, one of his arts was never to make clear the stand he took. So Jinnah then, or let's say the All India Muslim League, represents uh, the opposition to the Indian National Congress's claim that all Indians are one nation and all Indians should join in and liberate India from the yoke of British colonial rule. Now, maybe we must step back to explain how these two nationalisms actually emanate. As we know, the Indian National Congress was set up by some enlightened British liberal uh, bureaucrats who thought that they couldn't rule India for long unless the Indians were included in the government. And so the Indian National Congress started first with petitions to the king and queen at that time, Queen Victoria, but it gradually assumed a more nationalist posture. And as it happened, most of its leaders and its support base was in the coastal areas of India, which meant mostly the non-Muslim parts of India, although in Bombay there was a substantial Muslim representation in the beginning. As against this, from northern India, Sir Syed, who was very close to the British, he started campaigning that there are two nations only, Muslims and Hindus, and only one can rule over the other. I mean, people do quote him saying that there are Hindus and Muslims are the two eyes, sparkling eyes of India, but the actual substantive argument he took for Muslim separatism was that either Hindus will rule or Muslims will rule. And so one then notes people taking their cue from him. And in 1906, there is a deputation which goes to Lord Minto, the Viceroy, and presents a demand for separate electorates, which are granted in 1909. And I would argue that from 1909, the Muslims of India were structurally separated from the rest of India to demand communal rights in order to win elections, in order to get representation. But I'm not saying that at that moment these two parties were always at loggerheads. That's not my argument. But I'm saying these are the two main movements which started growing, evolving. We have to quickly cover a lot and come to the 1936 Lucknow presidential speech of Jawaharlal Nehru, where he says that in future India, we will have a socialist model of society and economy, and the Soviet system will inspire us to get rid of all the poverty and backwardness, and we'll establish industry and so on. Let me point out that as soon as he did that, already 5-6 leading members of the Congress party resigned, including Rajendra Prasad, Sardar Patel, Kripalani, the Sindhi leader, and a few others, heavyweights in the Indian National Congress. And it's Mahatma Gandhi who then brought them back. So next year, Nehru had to tone down that sort of radical, transformative program that he was pleading for, and then he started saying that this is the long-term project. Right now, we want to rid India of colonial rule. But there was an election in 1937 where the Muslim League and Congress fought more or less on the same program. The manifestos are very similar. There are small differences. And the Congress swept the elections, but not in the Muslim majority provinces. where the regional parties triumphed. Uh, the All India Muslim League lost everywhere in the Muslim majority provinces. In Punjab, it had, I think, 73 seats and it won two, of which one of them, Raja Ghazanfar Ali, crossed the floor and joined the Punjab Unionist Party, the regional party. None in Sindh and none in the Northwest Frontier province, where Khudai Khidmatgars were already aligned to the Indian National Congress. And in Bengal, they didn't do very well, but better than in the Northwest Western provinces. But in UP and I mean in the Muslim minority provinces, the Muslim League did a bit better, but still uh, it wasn't very impressive. And in the UP, they lost most of the seats. At that moment, the Congress made a decision on which the Muslim League then cashed on. And the decision was that those Muslim leaguers who were elected to the UP Assembly, they must resign from the Muslim League, join the Congress, and only then would they be considered for a ministership. I think the 1936 speech, followed by this, and Jawaharlal and Jinnah, who up until then was not really fully convinced about Pakistan or a separate state, he took up cudgels on behalf of this idea and started saying that, look, when Congress is still not ruling India, this is how it is dealing with us. So we either fight back and campaign for our identity and for our communal interests, or we perish. And I think this is the beginning of the Muslim League oriented transformation of the Muslim majority provinces, which were basically landlord provinces. The Muslim League went around and saying that if there's a Congress government ruling India, all of you are gone, wiped out, because zamindari system is the first thing on the list of the Congress. Anyhow, 1940, 23rd March, the Muslim League says that by virtue of being Muslims, Indian Muslims constitute not only a substantial minority, but also a separate, distinct nation with its own worldview, with its own sense of history, its own heroes, which are often the villains of the Hindus, and vice versa. We don't dine, we don't marry. So there is nothing which makes us one people. And for 7 years, he hammered in this argument. I mean, there is a totally false thesis going around that Jinnah did not want a separate Pakistan, and it is Congress which thrust Pakistan on Jinnah. In my book on Jinnah, the title is Jinnah, His Successes, Failures, and Role in History, which should be out on the 11th of September, Penguin, India. In over 800 pages, I show that this is a totally false claim. It's not substantiated by what Jinnah said during those 7 years. All that evidence has been omitted or suppressed. What he said was that under no circumstance are we willing to live in a united India. We want a separate Pakistan. And where should that Pakistan be? In the northwest and northeastern zones of the subcontinent, where Muslims were in a majority. Now, when the Muslim League demanded this, the Sikhs of Punjab, Sikh National Party of Sundar Singh Majithia, within 10 days he gave a call that if the Muslims demand the partition of India on a religious basis, then we will demand the partition of the Punjab also on the same basis. The Congress did not support it at that time. The Congress supports for the partition of Punjab and Bengal come much later, actually on the 8th of March 1947, and sometimes in April 1947 for the partition of Bengal. Because uh, the Congress was hoping, aiming that it will be able to get a united India and on its terms. And its terms included an effective center and the princely states also more or less amalgamated into this union. Okay. Now we note that there are two positions, and the British are the ones who have to judge it. You know, in the partition discussions, people have not actually looked at the role of the British, and I have two long chapters explaining why the British decided to partition India. Uh, the British were not wanting to leave India until 1973. This is what Lord Linlithgow told Lord Wavell when he met him in 1943 as Wavell was coming. But then comes the Second World War, and the British can't hold on to their colonies. And there is a Labour government which comes into power, and the Labour government is, of course, sympathetic to the Congress. But overall, whether Labour or Conservative, paramount remains the British strategic interests. And so, for example, on the 11th of May 1946, the Supreme Commander of the Indian Armed Forces, Field Marshal Auchinleck, he was given this task. He wrote a memorandum whether there should be Pakistan or not, and one argument for, one argument against. But he concludes that there should be no Pakistan, and the reason is that a divided India means a divided British Indian army. You see, the mainstay of British rule was this 2 million, 2.5 million strong Indian army, in which Muslims were there, Hindus were there, Sikhs were there, Gurkhas were there. And they thought that if we divide India, we also divide the army, and that's an invitation to Stalin and communism to move towards South Asia, which is poverty ridden, which is caste ridden, and so this would be easy bait for communism. But then we get Lord Mountbatten coming. Mountbatten speaks to all the leaders, and he realizes that there is not going to be a united India because the Congress wants a united India on the basis of its effective center. That is why it rejected the cabinet mission plan. Although there too, I correct people. The Congress rejected the cabinet mission plan, which was like a loose united India with all real powers vested in the provinces and the center taking charge only of communications, I think foreign affairs and military affairs. The rest were left to the provinces. And the princely states given the right to decide whether they want to join India or Pakistan or to remain independent. So this was rejected. But the Congress accepted going to the Indian Constituent Assembly and framing a constitution for a united India. So it is not a complete rejection of the cabinet mission plan, but a partial rejection. On the other hand, the Muslim League had accepted the cabinet mission plan, but refused to go to the Constituent Assembly. So I would say both actually rejected the total cabinet mission plan. And then comes Mountbatten, and he realizes that there is no chance that the two sides can agree to a formula that would keep India united on the terms of both these parties. It will be either this or that. And so he starts talking to all these leaders, and I think sometimes in May he decides that partitioned India is the only solution. On the 3rd of June, he announces the partition plan, where it is laid down that contiguous Muslim areas will be separated and given to Pakistan, and the Punjab and Bengal assemblies would decide whether they want to join India or Pakistan. But the process laid down was that both Bengal and Punjab assembly would be split into two. The Muslim majority districts of Bengal and Punjab will become one block, and the Hindu or Hindu Sikh majority districts will become the second block. If either of the two blocks of these provinces vote for partition, India will be partitioned. So I would say this was like tit for tat. If the Muslim League says that India should be partitioned on the basis of religion, then it had no moral argument, no rational argument to oppose the partition of Bengal and Punjab. But as we know, and let me underline this very strongly, I still insist that the partition of India is actually the partition of the Punjab, because of the 1 million plus people who were killed. At least 800,000 were Punjabis, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. And of the 14 million or 15 million that you mentioned, 10 million had to run for their lives across the Redcliffe line, which was drawn in the Punjab. Which means that of its population, including the British Punjab as well as the princely states, it was less than 40 million. It was, I think, 33.9 million, much less. So about 30% of the population of Punjab had to run for their lives. And at the end of the day, hardly any Muslim was left in East Punjab, except in this tiny state of Malerkotla, which we can discuss if you like, and almost none in West Punjab. So I call that also as ethnic cleansing. After the Second World War, it's not Yugoslavia or some other place, but in the Punjab that you can actually establish ethnic cleansing. And how did it take place? The British handed over power actually on the 15th. Pakistan celebrated its independence one day earlier, just to be different from India. But the power was not transferred until the 15th. And the Redcliffe Award was not announced until the 17th. And then people found that they were on the wrong side in millions. And then with the British gone, Sir Eamon Jenkins, I think, was a gentleman, and he really wanted to maintain the peace in the Punjab, and he pleaded for more troops, and he didn't get them. So when the power was transferred to the Indian Punjab and Pakistani Punjab, on both sides, I think the administrations were involved. They connived at it, they let it happen, and in some cases they were directly participating in the expulsion of unwanted minorities. And that is why what happened in the Punjab is not comparable to any other part of the subcontinent. Let me touch now Sindh. I think you mentioned that, and in this Jinnah book, I also look at how Sindhi Hindus fared in the partition process. In Sindh, there was one district, Tharparkar, which was actually on the border of Rajasthan. And there could have been a partition of sorts of even Sindh. But the whole of Sindh was given to Pakistan. And more or less, most Sindhis did not go after Sindhi Hindus because of their very long established Sufi traditions and festivals and so on. Strangely, these were there in the Punjab also, but that's a different story we can discuss. Because in the Punjab, you had armed people on both sides, which is probably not the case in Sindh. Anyhow, it's when Muslims from Bihar, especially because in Bihar there was a massacre of Muslims, and then from other parts of India, Urdu speaking, when they came to Karachi, they they attacked the Sindhis. And so from January 1948, sometimes in September, there are attacks on Sindhi Hindus and Sikhs leaving Sindh, but not large scale. All this sort of gains momentum as we go into 1948, and then it is completed uh, by the end of 1948. Whereas in the Punjab, everything was done already in 1947 on both sides. Still, in the interior of Sindh, about 700,000 Hindus stayed on. Mostly they were caste Hindus, but also Dalits. And that, let me also underscore this, the partition scheme required that while the people, all communities will stay put, the officers and functionaries will change, will opt for a state of their liking, which I think was absurd. Because once the state has officers who are not sympathetic to you, the state becomes partisan. And so what happened was that on both sides there were partisan administrations equally determined to get rid of minorities. I quote Master Tara saying that no Muslim can be loyal to India, and I advise them to leave India. And to Hindus and Sikhs who are still in Pakistan, my advice is similar. And then I quote a letter of 4th September written by the governor of Punjab to Muhammad Ali Jinnah, saying that there are 400,000 Sikhs who are not going to India from Lailpur, which is now Faisalabad, and we have to get rid of them because there are hundreds and thousands of Muslims coming from East Punjab. So we have no other place for them to keep. So there we also have evidence that the two administrations were complicit in the expulsion of unwanted minorities. Even in East Punjab, the peasant is tied to the land, worked for generations on it. Nobody wants to leave his home. And they were also forced out of their homes. So the problem has been these competing, conflicting, clashing ideas of civilization. I would like to add that both are actually constructions, social constructions. There was no Indian nation ever. India was a pilotara of ethnic communities, village communities, caste communities, regional, configurations. And the Muslims of India were never one community. The Shia-Sunni conflict is deep-rooted. It almost annually leads to some sort of trouble. Neither Hindu or neither all Indians were one nation. Neither were Muslims by themselves a separate nation. I think India's advantage is that when partition took place, there were minorities on both sides. Since the Indian model, the Congress model, was that all those who are born on Indian territory are Indians, they were able to, frame an inclusive idea of nation and establish a secular state and a secular constitution. So there is no official religion of the Indian state. People have religion, and there is something like equal respect for all religion and so on. But in Pakistan, the problem was that there were still some non-Muslims, whereas the state had been created essentially for Muslims. And what we know is that had the Hindus and Sikhs stayed on in West Pakistan, there would be 21% of the population of West Pakistan, which is Pakistan now. Whereas they were already 23 of East Bengal, and that has gone down to about 10, some say 8%. Whereas already in 1947, of the 21% Hindus and Sikhs of West Pakistan, I would say Sindh, Punjab, Northwest Frontier, British Balochistan and Kalat, which are now Balochistan is a province, 4 provinces, would have been 21%. But already in 1947, they were reduced to 1.6%. And up until now, 73 years later, they are 1.6%. Whereas in India, when all this had happened, Muslims had been expelled from East Punjab, Hindus and Sikhs from West Punjab, and later from the rest of West Pakistan. In India, 9.8% Muslims were still there in all other provinces. Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Bengal, Gujarat, Odisha, all these provinces. They are now, according to Indian census, 14.2, some say 15%. So Indian record in dealing with these minorities is far superior, I would say, notwithstanding the recent years of events they have unfolded. I think I would stop here. I don't know if I have taken my 45 minutes. Please let me know. I might want to add something, but if I've trespassed the minutes you gave me, then I think this is time for me to stop. Thank you very much.
You have some more time in case, 5 more minutes if you'd like to.
Yes, the thing is that the tragedy of the partition is that you so very rightly pointed out, it's never gone. Let me present you the contrast. In India, partition is a lament. In Pakistan, the national narrative is it is liberation. We would have, from the British, gone under the tutelage of the Hindus, who were moneylenders, who were more educated, who were, in the Punjab at least, 80% of the revenue was paid by Hindus and Sikhs. 75% of the businesses and industries were owned by Hindus and Sikhs. Their contribution to building educational institutions were greater, hospitals. All those things are there. And they argued that on such a basis, because in the terms of references, it was not only contiguous Muslim and non-Muslim areas to be separated, but also other factors. And on the basis of other factors, they argued that they should get Sialkot, because Sialkot has some importance for Hindu and Sikh history. Then they want Nankana Sahib, which is Sheikhupura, because Guru Nanak was born there. They wanted Lahore, where they had so much economic interest, and Guru Arjan was born there. They wanted Lailpur, where they claimed they had a lot of property. They wanted Mandgumri, which is now called Sahiwal, where they had a lot of land. So they were, if those areas were given to India, then I would say that the Radcliffe Award was unfair to Pakistan. I have argued that insofar as the Punjab is concerned, the Radcliffe Award gives Pakistan 99.9% of what it demanded. And it's India which was denied. Whereas in Bengal, it's a different balance, but not so drastic. So what I'm trying to say is that that bitterness is still there. Let me give you an example. You give me a chance to talk about the oral histories. In 2016, I think, I received an email from Naseem Hassan, an engineer who was born in Shimla, but with his family, they escaped in 1947. He was 3-4 years old. And his story is in my Punjab book, if you read it. Now, he had, with my permission, published that also in a community, media somewhere in Baltimore or something. And a Sikh read it. And he contacted Naseem Hassan saying that I have a stepmother who I know she has for all these years concealed this, but she has 5 Muslim children somewhere in Pakistan, and she is now very old and longs for them. Can you help her trace her children. So Naseem Hassan said, look, I have no such connections. Ishtiaq Ahmed, he writes a weekly column, so let me try through him. I wrote a weekly column, I think, on the 8th of December or 4th of December 2016, help a mother find her children. But this article was in English and published in Lahore, and a month passed and nobody noticed it. By that time, my Punjab book had been published, and I came to India. I was in Bombay, staying with a Sindhi family, very nice people. They are like my family. And I checked my daily mail, and there I find an email from Karachi saying that I am so, daughter of this woman, in the name of Rasulullah and in the name of whatever, please help me connect with my mother. You see, what they had done is, after a month, since there was no response, they had it translated into Urdu and published in Karachi, in Jang. And there, the journalist was some nice person. He gave my email because I was the original author of that article. So that is how her children had read it in Delhi. And then finally they met. A year later, they came to Nankana Sahib, and the children came from Karachi, 5 of them, and they were united. The story is, it has many other aspects of it, but I think the time is not enough to tell the whole story. What I still want to say is that in 2014 at LUMS, I was telling this fascinating story of how finally Harbhajan Kaur, who stayed on in Pakistan, became Shanaz Begum, was sold off to many men. Afzal Khan married her, and then they went to India, and the Sikh family said, we keep our daughter, you take your children and go. That's how the families were separated. The Afzal Khan had taken his wife in good faith, but her parents said, no, we don't want you and the children, you go to Pakistan. And so Afzal Khan then went back to Karachi, and the children grew up believing their mother had died. So what had happened was that, how did Urdu translation start? Naseem Hassan knew somebody, also from Pakistan, Tufail Uppal, and talked to him, an old man. And Tufail Uppal said, just a moment, is it Raja Sansi you are saying, the village? And Harbhajan Kaur? And he said, yes. He said, I attended her wedding in 1946. So I know her. So Tufail Uppal's son-in-law knew this journalist in Jang who wrote it, and that is how they connected. And I was telling this story to my students at LUMS. And one girl said, Tufail Uppal was my Dada's brother. I said, really? And then she said, please let me go and check. So she talked to her father, and they confirmed. This family was also from Raja Sansi before 1947. And Tufail Uppal was not the real brother of his grandfather, but they were like brothers. So close, nobody knew this. This was another biradri, let's say. So in my latest edition of Oxford, I've written that how can you say that the partition, story will ever end? My 2014 young girl, 1920, is connected to this partition because of all these very strange things. So I think now maybe the time is done, and we can have a discussion. Thank you very much. Yes, Professor Roy.
Thank you, Professor Ahmed. Only you could have done this, to talk about, to tell us about how partition happened, and
Yes.
what you have culled from so many books, from so many scholarly books. You narrated it like a smoothless history. I'm sure I'd forgotten how lucid you've always been, and how you can summarize very complex concepts into very simple stories and simple arguments. Um, Thank you so much. Many of the listeners here, many of the scholars in particular, they don't have a background in political science. So I'm
Hmm.
sure many of the scholars who are from literary studies or history, not even from histories, I'm sure they have learned as much as I have.
So, thank you so much.
So any final word, Ishtiyaq Saab? ਤੁਸੀਂ ਲਾਸਟ ਟਾਈਮ ਜਨਮਸ਼ਟਮੀ ਤੇ ਭਜਨ ਗਾਇਆ ਸੀ ਉਹ ਕ੍ਰਿਸ਼ਨ ਦਾ ਭਜਨ your voice is muted you have to unmute I said any final word would you like to share with us maybe a bhajan or a song
ਭਜਨ ਔਰ ਸੌਂਗ ਭਜਨ ਤੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਯੂ نو ਆਈ ਐਮ ਨਾਟ ਅ ਬਲੀਵਰ ਇਨ ਐਨੀ ਸੈਂਸ ਤੇ ਕੋਈ
ਉਹ
ਗਾਣਾ
ਮੇਰਾ
ਕਿਹੜਾ ਸੁਣੋਗੇ ਗਾਣਾ ਸੁਣਾ ਦਿਆਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਕੋਈ
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਹਾਂਜੀ
ਅੱਛਾ ਯਾਰ
ਦੇਸ਼ ਭਗਤੀ ਦਾ
ਅ- ਸੁਣ ਲਓ ਇਹ ਹੈ ਜੇ ਆਪਣਾ ਮੁਕੇਸ਼ ਦਾ ਗਾਇਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਉਹ ਮੇਰਾ ਫੇਵਰੇਟ ਹੈ
ਅੱਛਾ ਜੀ
ਔਰ ਫਿਲਮ ਤੋਹਫਾ ਦੀ ਇਹ ਗਜ਼ਲ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਔਰ ਲਿਖੀ ਸੀ ਵੀ ਇੱਕ ਲਖਨਊ ਦੇ ਉਸਤਾਦ ਹੋਰਾਂ ਨੇ ਤੇ ਇਹ ਸੁਣ ਲਓ कहाँ तक जफा हुस्न वालों की सहते जवानी जो रहती तो फिर हम न रहते कहाँ तक जफा नशे मन न जलता निशानी तो रहती नशे मन न जलता निशानी तो रहती हमारा था क्या ठीक रहते न रहते हमारा था क्या कोई नक्श और कोई दीवार समझा कोई नक्श और कोई दीवार समझा जमाना हुआ हमको चुप रहते रहते जमाना हुआ जमाना बड़े शौक से सुन रहा था हम ही सो गए दास्तां कहते कहते हम ही सो गए लो जी अंजलि जी मैं करती पूरी ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ख्वाहिश ठीक है फरमाइश ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਮਿਹਰਬਾਨੀ ਜੀ
शुक्रिया
ਮਿਹਰਬਾਨੀ
शुक्रिया
थैंक यू जी
Thank